Today's story takes us through golden-lit streets, stolen moments, and the kind of love that finds you when you least expect it. Let's dive into Julian and Clara's unforgettable journey. The lights of Paris spilled golden warmth across its cobblestone streets as Julian Royce sat alone in his penthouse atop Avenue Montaigne. A 43, he was one of France's wealthiest and most influential heirs, CEO of Royce Capital, a financial empire spanning 3 generations. With his striking features, composed elegance, and razor-sharp intellect, Julian graced the covers of business magazines and gossip columns alike, often dubbed Paris's most eligible bachelor. Yet within the soaring glass walls and lavish interiors crafted by Italian artisans lived a soul marked by solitude and quiet contradiction. Julian had long avoided romantic entanglements, pressured by a controlling family, burdened by elite society's expectations, and shadowed by social anxiety. He chose a life immersed in numbers and negotiations rather than people and emotions. On his oakwood desk lay a gold-foiled envelope, a formal invitation to the prestigious art gala his company was sponsoring at the Louvre. Julian picked it up, his chest tightening. Another evening of spotlights, strangers, and the unrelenting pressure to perform. But this time, his eyes lingered on the attached guest list. A name he didn't recognize stirred something unfamiliar in him. Clara Duval, lead photographer, event coverage. Outside his window, Paris shimmered under a misting rain. Julian rose and stepped to the glass. His breath left a soft fog on the surface. Like his heart, once sealed behind walls of calculation, now stirred unexpectedly by nothing more than a name. Paris slipped into night like a velvet curtain, draping the Louvre in warmth and mystery. Inside its marble halls, the click of designer heels and soft aristocratic murmurs composed a quiet symphony of old money and polished grace. Crystal chandeliers shimmered like galaxies, casting fractured light upon artworks that had survived time itself. Clara Duval moved quietly through that world, not as a guest of prestige, but as a storyteller behind the lens. At 18, she was the youngest photographer ever invited to cover an event at the Louvre. Born to a modest family in Marseille, where sunlight on brick walls became her first canvas, Clara wasn't fluent in luxury, but she spoke the language of observation and feeling. Her silver Leica rested comfortably in her hands, a familiar weight. She drifted like a shadow among the guests, capturing moments rather than participating in them. The weary gaze of an aging philanthropist, the trembling hand of a debutante in her first evening gown, the radiant joy of a child from the children's hospital, these were the truths Clara sought. She didn't want perfection, she wanted the human pulse beneath the gold. Then a misstep. A group of guests spun in laughter, forcing Clara to step back quickly. Her heels slid against polished marble. The camera tilted, fingers tightened, too late. But someone caught it, and she looked up. The man before her could step from a Renaissance portrait, tall, elegant, sculpted with restraint. Dark brown hair framed a face too symmetrical to be accidental. But it was his eyes, a blue so deep it seemed to mourn, that held her still. I'm sorry. His voice was low, nearly a whisper. No, thank you. You saved my camera, Clara replied, her fingers still trembling from the fall. His eyes flicked to the Leica, then back to her, slower, fuller, as if he were seeing something unfiltered for the very first time. I'm Julian, he said softly. A single moment stretched between them, wide and weightless. The Louvre seemed to hush. Even the music faded into something distant. Among ancient statues and long-dead kings, 2 strangers stood still, wordless but not silent. And then, perhaps afraid to disturb something fragile, Julian dipped his head slightly and turned away, vanishing into the crowd in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Clara stayed where she was, camera steady but heartbeat wild. Through her viewfinder, she caught his glance back at her. Not curious, not polite, but something quieter, a silent acknowledgement. A promise unspoken between 2 souls who had yet to say each other's names. After that brief moment in the grand hall, Julian found it impossible to return to the crowd as if nothing had changed. Her eyes, that smile, and the way she thanked him, It was so genuine, so startling, that everything else had faded to gray. Minutes later, he stepped away from the main ballroom and walked the long corridor leading to the museum's back garden, a place softly lit with golden lanterns and heavy with blooming jasmine. It was quieter here, and he needed that silence to steady his pulse. Clara was already there. She was crouched by a cluster of lavender cascading from a stone arch, capturing the light slanting through the petals. She blended so seamlessly with the space, he might have missed her if not for the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. "Didn't expect to see you again this soon," she said without turning, though her smile was unmistakable in her tone. "I didn't expect to come out here," Julian replied, his voice softer than usual. "But maybe I needed something real." They stood in shared silence, wrapped in floral scent and golden dusk, exchanging no more than a few soft words, but it was enough. A quiet conversation without weight, yet with gravity. When Clara walked away, her footsteps brushing over the gravel like a hush, Julian remained beneath the vines. His heart, long sealed beneath polished ice, skipped, ever so slightly, a single crack forming across a winter that had lasted too long. 3 weeks later, the Paris sky wore soft blush tones as Julian stepped into the enchanted world of the Charity Gala, hosted beneath a vintage circus tent in Montsouris Park. The red and white striped pavilion felt pulled from a childhood dream, its twinkling lights casting golden magic across faces young and old. Children from orphanages mingled with patrons in silk gowns and tailored suits, the boundaries of class momentarily blurred beneath the spell of whimsy. Julian had personally extended an invitation to Clara via a message delivered by his assistant, accompanied by a note that read simply, "If you're still photographing, Paris still has beauty worth keeping." When he saw a silhouette in a wine-red dress, hair curled softly, camera in hand, his heart jumped. "Clara?" he asked, moving quickly. She turned, not her. Then again, and again, the same dress, similar hair, wrong every time. Embarrassment crept up his collar like heat. One woman mistook his gaze for flirtation and lingered far too long. Julian, usually so composed, struggled to find polite exits from conversations he didn't start. He finally found her backstage, capturing fleeting moments as acrobats adjusted costumes. She looked up, surprised, then smiled. "I hear you've been looking for me," she teased, camera still cradled in her hand. Julian laughed, the first real breath he'd taken all evening. 3 near misses, same dress, same hair, but none of them were you. They sat on a bench tucked beside a makeshift garden. No words at first. They weren't needed. Julian reached into his pocket and offered a small velvet box in his palm. "I saw it in an antique shop and thought if anyone saw the world like an unwritten story, it would be you." Clara opened the box. Inside lay a silver pendant, an intricately carved vintage camera, delicate as memory itself. She didn't speak for a long moment. "No one's ever given me something that felt like me," she said softly, her eyes glinting with something tender. Julian hesitated. "May I?" She nodded. As he fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers brushed the warm skin at the nape of her neck, a barely there touch, but in his world, it echoed like thunder. For the first time, Julian didn't want to hide from feeling. No prepared lines, no polished mask. He was simply a man, and she was the realest thing he had ever touched. In a small gallery tucked within the Marais district, warm lights washed over rough stone walls and framed moments of life, where Clara Duval was quietly living a dream she never dared to name. At 19, she was holding her first solo photography exhibition, Between the Moments. Her photos captured the quiet rhythm of Paris, a child laughing in the rain, an old woman selling pastries by the Seine, lovers embracing at a metro stop, and at the very center was him, Julian. The largest print, displayed in the heart of the gallery, showed him beneath the circus lights, his head slightly tilted, eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. Clara had taken it during the gala, unposed, unaware, just a man, lost in a crowded world. She had never shown him the photo before. When Julian entered the gallery, she saw him stop. He stared at the portrait like he didn't recognize the loneliness it held. Or perhaps, like no one had ever seen him with such gentleness before. "You see me," he said softly, once he reached her. "Not like they do, but truly, see." Clara smiled, fingers brushing the camera pendant he had given her. "And I still do," she replied. That evening, she invited him to her small apartment for dinner, not as a date, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. Julian stepped into the kitchen. His sleeves rolled neatly. He minced garlic, sautéed mushrooms, and reduced a wine sauce with the ease of someone who had long loved silence and creation. The scents filled the modest space, and Clara found herself moved in ways she hadn't expected. "I didn't know you could cook," she said, watching him plate the pasta like arranging flowers. "I didn't know you'd make me want to share it," he answered, voice quiet but warm. When dinner ended and golden light filtered through the old window panes, they sat beside each other in silence, the kind that carried weight. Julian turned, his fingers grazing her cheek. "May I?" She nodded. And so their first kiss came, not as a peak, but as the soft ending to a melody that had been playing since the moment they met. After their first kiss that night, Clara and Julian didn't say much, but in the soft gold of her small kitchen, the silence carried more truth than words ever could. When he left, her fingers lingered on the doorframe, as if trying to hold the moment a bit longer. And then, slowly, like light through curtains, they began seeing each other more often. Quiet dinners in her apartment, morning coffees on his herb-lined rooftop where lavender bloomed like secrets. Their days no longer belonged to themselves, but to something unnamed that grew between them. Julian had never let anyone in this far, and because of that, he wanted to do something more, to show the world the woman who had quietly altered the way he saw everything. "I want you to come to the gala next week," he said one evening, their fingers laced on a bench under the stars. "Not just as my guest, as someone who matters." Clara paused. "I'm your quiet place, Julian. Don't ask that quiet place to speak too loud." He tightened his grip. "You're not my quiet. You're my love." A week later, at 8 p.m., she walked into the Louvre, the very place where 3 months before he had stood among the crowd and she had accidentally captured his gaze through her lens. But tonight, the museum was silent, empty, except for her and the flickering path of candles stretching from the hall to the Egyptian wing. 10,000 white roses lined the floor like a river made of petals and light. Her favorite music drifted through the stillness. Clair de Lune, soft and aching. At the far end stood Julian, holding a small, leather-bound album. When she reached him, he opened it, not to speak, but to show her. Photographs. But not hers. These were images he had taken of her, from afar, quietly, over the last 3 months. Capturing her crouched over flowers, framed by light in her studio, sleeping on the balcony, wrapped in golden sunset. "I thought, maybe this is the only way you could truly see yourself, through the eyes of someone who loves you," he said. Then he dropped to one knee, not with grandeur, but with a tremble that spoke louder than ceremony. A velvet box opened in his hands. Inside lay a moonstone ring, its color shifting gently like her, mysterious, luminous, real. "Clara Duval," he said, voice trembling, "you gave me a reason to live honestly. Let me spend the rest of my life seeing this world with you." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. No words, just a leap into his arms, surrounded by the sea of white roses and candlelight, where love needed no hiding, no disguises. Just truth, tenderness, and the promise of forever. After the magical proposal at the Louvre, it seemed every barrier had finally fallen. Julian no longer hid their love. He brought Clara to events, had her name listed on foundation art projects. Together they painted a future, modest but full of love. But in Julian's world, love was not always enough. Madame Royce, his mother, elegant in appearance, iron beneath, never hid her disdain. To her, Clara's humble origins were a stain on their legacy. 1 week after the engagement, At a private gathering at the Royce estate, a scandal unfolded. A carefully edited surveillance clip showed Clara seemingly raising her voice at an esteemed guest in a shadowed hallway. The video, stripped of context, spread like wildfire. Tabloids branded her entitled, a social climber with no sense of place. Julian was in Italy on business. By the time he returned, Clara was gone. Julian found the letter on her wooden table, the one where they'd shared countless late-night meals. Beside it lay a photograph of them together, taken in the rooftop garden. Clara was mid-laugh, her head tilted. Julian stared at her in the photo, vulnerable in a way only she ever saw. "Julian, I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you. I'm leaving because I love you enough not to become the reason your world falls apart." Yesterday at Hotel Montclair, your mother and the PR team staged a scene, subtle but enough for the tabloids to begin spinning stories about me, about a past they invented. I have nothing to hide, but I don't have the strength to fight. You were born into this world, I wasn't, and I can't ask you to choose between me and everything you've built. The ring stays, I don't. Let this love be the most beautiful thing we ever had, not the thing that breaks everything else. Clara. Julian didn't read the letter twice. He didn't need to. Every word carved itself into him like a blade. The ring box sat open on the table, still, silent. He reached for it, then stopped, as if afraid touching it would make her absence too real. He picked up the photograph. In that moment, they had believed in forever. But love doesn't always end for lack of feeling. Sometimes, the world simply breaks what is most fragile. That night, Julian sat alone in the rooftop garden she once tended with such care. The lights of Paris shimmered below, as they always had, but amidst all that brilliance, all he could see was the space where Clara used to be. But days later, Lucienne, the long-serving housekeeper, called him to the library. There she handed him the unedited video, untouched. She whispered, "You deserve to know the truth. It was your mother. She arranged everything." Julian closed his hand around the pendant. For the first time in his life, he chose not to stay silent. Julian chose not to stay silent. He held a press conference, not with a prepared speech, not with a spokesperson, just him and the unedited footage that revealed the truth. Clara was innocent, and the incident at the Royce estate had been carefully staged by none other than his own mother. Immediately after, Julian left Paris, his destination, Marseille. But he had no address, no house number. All he had was a photograph of Clara smiling under a window draped in ivy, captioned, "Home, where I learned to take my first photo." Marseille in late spring was golden with sun, and the sea shimmered like glass. Julian stepped off the train, no map, no guide. Only a fragile hope and a love loud enough to echo in his chest. He showed the photo to the flower seller by the fountain, the boy mending fishing nets at the dock, the old mechanic outside a faded paint shop. "I'm looking for this girl. Her name is Clara." A day passed, then another. By the third afternoon, as fatigue and despair began to win, an elderly woman selling lavender biscuits looked at the photo, then smiled. "Duval's daughter, yes, pale yellow house down the hill near the lake. You'll know it by the ivy." Julian ran. His heart beat wild as the old wooden gate came into view. The house, just like the photo, and there she was, Clara, watering lavender near the fence. "I didn't find you with a map, only faith." She didn't speak, her eyes shimmered, but she didn't rush into his arms. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she asked. "I thought you needed time, but I was wrong. I should have been there when you needed me most." "I know you didn't leave because you were afraid to love me. You left because you were afraid of ruining my world." He took another step. "But that world means nothing if you're not in it." Clara clenched her fists, then released them. And finally, she embraced him, tight, breathless, his warmth, familiar, healing. Their kiss wasn't dramatic, it was gentle and real. Then he placed in her hand the ring, a ring that had always belonged to her, all along. A few days later, they returned to Paris. Julien took Clara to meet his mother. Madame Royce waited in the parlor. Her usual poise was replaced by quiet fatigue, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm not here to ask permission," Julien said. "We're getting married." Madame Royce remained silent, then looked at Clara, no longer with distance but with remorse. "I was afraid of losing my son to someone I didn't understand. But it turns out it was me who pushed him away." "I was wrong," she said softly. "If you can forgive me, I want to be part of your day." Clara looked at Julien, then nodded gently. The wedding took place on a sunlit rooftop terrace as early autumn leaves began to turn. It was the same place where they'd shared their first laugh, their first silence, and their almost goodbye. Julien wore a silver-gray suit. Clara wore a simple white silk gown, holding a bouquet of lavender. The camera pendant shimmered beneath her neckline, a symbol of all they had endured. They didn't make grand promises, but when they looked into each other's eyes, they knew. If love is true, it will find its way back, and this time, it will stay. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a quiet hope, don't forget to give it a like and share it with someone who still believes in love that heals. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you had to let them go? Subscribe to Noah's Stories for more soul-touched tales, where every heartbeat becomes a story worth telling.